Eric with
have your team operate more like that car on the left and less like the car on the right. So when user stories are too big and bulky or don't have enough detail or context, engineers can easily get kind of like stuck in the mud, as it were, and have to figure out a lot of stuff on their own. Giving them the right context so that they can do what they do best and move forward with the technical decision making is really kind of the goal here, is like to help everybody utilize their strengths and be on the same page so they can be making informed choices together. So a couple definitions to make sure that we're all on the same page. Might be old news to some of you. Please correct me if so. But a user story, what we're talking about when we say user story is really these short, simple descriptions of a feature. And it's usually told by the perspective of the person who kind of needs that feature. So a user usually, but it could be a different kind of consumer of a system. And in this deck, we'll kind of show stories as like these, like one little circle here. But a backlog, of course, for an engineering team and a cross-functional team is essentially a whole list of stories that have been written that need to be developed potentially in a certain order in order to create a product that you're looking to build. So it's kind of a list of all those tasks or user stories that need to be built in order for that product to achieve its goal. All right, this is a quick little preview. Just keep in mind this word invest, because we're going to be seeing more of that in the future, and maybe this will help it stick in your mind a little bit. These are a lot of the attributes that we like better user stories to be. But the framework that Mary and I have put together for you here and have been using for, as she said, upwards of 10 years, which is kind of wild, to me to reflect on. It's been a long time since we worked together in person, but what we've really found is that if everyone on your team has the right context from like kind of the high level down to the detail before writing stories, actually, that is like half the work and can really streamline the process and make it A, easier to write those stories, and B, really easier for everyone on the team to pick those stories up and make use of them. So the first, the steps here really are like at a high level, identify your target customer or user or like who's getting the value from this thing. Understand a little bit, just enough at least, about their customer journey. This is kind of second nature to the designers in the room, probably a lot of the product managers too. And then once you have that context, really thinking about broad brush strokes, a high level story map for the product, and then taking a slice of that, which is your next phase or release of the product or MVP, and adding those crisp story details once you have those. But this also works for existing product backlogs too. So, what we had here on the last slide is if it's a new product, right, you're going to want to kind of start from the beginning. But also if it's an existing product that you're just evolving and is already in the marketplace, this context is still really critical and can still really help you get to these better stories and backlog. Cool. I'm going to scroll down to the chat a little bit. Yeah, please, as a reminder, person that are demographic focused, but depending on the product that you're working on, you might have more or less of that. Let's see. Okay. All right. And then also today we're going to be talking through a sample project. So we'll be having using a fictitious project to kind of show how we do some of these things. So this project is a book recommendation app. We're going to imagine that we have been tasked with creating an app that recommends books for people. I will say we created this like before Amazon and Kindle were like a major player in this space. So maybe we should think about updating our product here. I don't think it's revolutionary at this point, but you all will get the idea about what we're trying to do with these user stories. So say we're going to make this app. And so as a team, as a cross-functional team, we get together. Maybe we have a user researcher on our team, which would be awesome. But even if not, we can all get together and talk about, okay, who are we really designing this for? We're really going to shoot for people who enjoy reading books and actually want to give and receive recommendations on the latest and greatest. For our first kind of MVP or minimum viable product, thank you someone for answering that question in the chat. we're going to assume that this person is in their 20s to 40s, lives in London, works in tech, and English is their first language. That doesn't mean that we are only designing something only for people that live in London or that speak English, but that the first round of our product, we're going to really try to make it work for this audience for X reason, right? There might be a strategic reason why we're going after this market. That's something for a whole nother strategic class. All right. Any questions on that target customer piece and the amount of detail that you need? Obviously, I love going deep into user insights and who users are. But I think the main point for you all here today is that, for a cross-functional team, when you're going to write some stories, you don't necessarily have to have a ton of understanding about your user, but at least everyone be on the same page about it at a high level. Cool. Okay, so the customer journey then. Let's find out a little bit more about their context and what they're going to do in the product. So when we talk about a customer journey, we're talking about, it could be a current journey experience, or it could be more of an ideal user experience that's displayed as a series of steps that this customer can take within your product. This is probably old news to a lot of designers in here. Those of you that aren't designers, you can lean on your designer friends at your companies to help you out with some of this stuff. But really anybody can do it. And there's lots of ways to define a customer journey. This picture you see here feels like the old days when we, we're all in person with our paper and sticky notes. But the main steps that you need to do is you've already identified who the customer or user is in the scenario. And then you want to capture each key moment or step in the scenario that's happening in their life, and then potentially within the product as well. And then underneath each of those key moments, you might want to layer in some different information that you have, like what the customer need is at that current point, maybe any pain points they have with the existing process, maybe ideas for features that you're thinking about. And so here's an example from that same car insurance project where, we'd already talked about Ruby. Here she is. But we've kind of put this in a linear journey about becoming aware of updating her insurance, educating herself, finding out that this is the insurance that's right for her. There's an actual accident and what's going on there. The feelings involved with trying to navigate that whole process, starting to get back to normal feelings and feeling really good about it. I've needed to kind of gray out some of the words here for client confidentiality, but you can see that we've layered on a fair amount of information, and this can all depend on what seems useful for your team, right? We had emojis to let and quotes to know how a user's feeling at these moments. We also had customer needs and pain points in those blue boxes underneath for each step. What are the kinds of things that this user is thinking and doing, and that we might be able to help with as a product team? So this can just be created in a slide deck. It could be, something like Google Slides. It could be, a fancier collaboration tool like Miro or Jamboard or FigJam or something. Really, the name of the game is just to get it all in one place and make sure that everybody can contribute to it and can digest it and find it easily. Cool. So on that recommendation piece, let's see. So here's the customer journey of within the app. So this is another way to do it. I think it's great to have the larger context of a person's lived experience, but then you also, when you've got an eye for user stories and backlog creation, you're also going to want to think about the experience within the product specifically, and what are kind of the steps that somebody's going to be taking through this product that makes sense. And then you can imagine that underneath each of these steps, you can be layering on a lot of that information that we just showed in the last example. Okay, I'm going to pass off to Miriam for now, unless there are any questions. That's a great question. Okay, so this was in the private Q&A. SN asked, how would this be different to an empathy map? Yeah, so there are so many types of journey maps, empathy maps, user maps that can be created. And honestly, you could like do a web search on this and get pretty far down the rat hole looking at like image results for all these different things. I think in this case, let's see. So an empathy map is really similar, right? Like the goal of both of these things in a way is to increase team empathy for the user and what they're going through and what they need at a certain point. So an empathy map is really just like a specific format of that. One flavor, you could say, of this kind of journey mapping. Sometimes an empathy map is more like just about this person in general. Maybe it's a little bit more like the target customer definition, like really understanding about this person and what we can be empathetic to in their life. The customer journey step specifically is more about like getting more of an over time view of what they're doing and feeling. So I guess the short answer is that they're really related. And I don't think it's that you should do one versus the other. I think it's the important thing is to look at as a team, what is kind of the bare minimum context that your cross-functional team needs to have alignment and understanding of your user and their lived experience in order to create the best product and stories for them. I hope that helps. You can always just do a web search for empathy map, customer journey, user journey, also things like service design map. Like there's all sorts of tools out there. Great question. Okay, take it away, Marian.
Okay, so going back to what Kylie was talking about throughout the framework, so we went up to step 3. So we talked about the target customers, we talked about the customer journey, and now it's time to talk about story map and how to turn that customer journey that Kylie talked about into a story map. So let's just go through some descriptions here that we are going to use throughout the course. So obviously you will hear about a lot about user stories, and let's just go through some of the kind of definitions here to make sure we are all on the same page. So a user story is a very short description of what the product or the service should do from perspective of the user. It's basically a small piece of functionality that relates to business value. It's a good tool for iterative development. So if you want to have iterative development, these stories are great to just kind of split the work. It's a unit of work that should be developed. And again, that's how we use it in iterative development as well. It's a placeholder for conversation. You know, we don't want to just have description of like all the things that needs to be done in a story. The story is like a really great place for people to have debate, conversations about what is the right way to do things, why are we doing what we want to do, and having these healthy conversations about the tasks. It should focus on the value, and also it provides shared understanding, because that's a very important part. Some people don't write stories. They just say, we already know what you want to do. You're going to go and do it. But that's the point. You already know what you're going to do. But the next person might have totally different understanding. And when they together, they might write totally different things. So having one kind of story written by the team that everyone knows and is aware of, and going forward with that will help to make sure everyone is on the same page. So this is the definition of the user stories. We will use Epic here as well. Epic is a collection of user stories that in a way they belong to the same feature, or they are related to each other, or they achieve the same goals. It's more like a wrapper around stories that are very kind of relevant to each other. And then we have Story Map, which is basically a tool to organize all the features and the stories based on the user journey that we have for our customers. It basically can be used to facilitate prioritization, planning, and discussion. So it's basically a very, in my experience, the best way to do that is to have a very visual way of showing all the stories, all the tasks that Kylie explained all the tasks and the stories that can cover the journey that Kylie mentioned. So we will talk to you through an example to make it more clear, but it's basically to show for each journey what needs to be done. There are a couple of steps to create a story map, which is a very important kind of artifact that you want to get out of this step. First is just to just to bring if you already have your user journey, the to-be user journey, just bring it to the room and kind of list the high-level part of that group. Then break each key step into a smaller activities as much as is needed. This is an example. This is something, a kind of practice that you need to do with your team to know how much you want to go into details, how much you want to break stories into smaller stories. And that comes with the practice. And each team might have totally different preferences, but try to don't be kind of fussy, maybe in the first place. Try to experiment with some of the kind of ways and see how it goes. But the point is to break each step into a smaller step. And then set each of those kind of high-level steps and activities as epic, and then each epic can, again, be broken into smaller stories. So make sure that the epics are kind of contains the stories that are related to each other, or they have some sort of kind of similarity in terms of the goals that they want to achieve. So once we do that, this is one of the boards that's from one of the projects that Kylie and I worked together in London. So this was how we broke one of the customer journeys into story map. As you can see, the green cards are representing the epics. And then in front of each green card, we have all the stories that are relevant to each other and are relevant to that epic. So we kind of group them into the epics that we have. So this is what we are expecting to have when we talk about the story map. Obviously, with these days, you might not have a physical kind of way of showing this story map as we have now on the photo. But usually having a physical one, if possible, is also very helpful for the team, especially where the team is located. Having this board, everyone can see it. Everyone can see what is involved in their backlog and see what is involved in each epic is super helpful and important. So if I go back to our book recommendation app, let's see how we can turn the user journey that Kylie talked about into a story map. So this is the customer journey that we talked about. This is the to-be customer journey, starting from opening the app, click on sign up, and all the way to log off from the app. So I'll try to break this into smaller, high-level tasks as this. So, and these are the epics that I created. So I have a sign up epic, and I put all the kind of stories that I could think about for that epic underneath it. So when I say sign up, the stories that came to my mind is that I can sign up with Facebook, for example, sign up with emails, confirming emails, sign up with Google. And each of these can be on their own story that can be independently done. But they are still related, all related to sign up. We have login as an epic. So we have login, log out, forget password, and reset password. Again, all the stories similar to each other and achieving the same goal are part of this epic. Activity timeline, which is viewing activity, liking activity, and commenting, again, part of one. My library is another epic that I created, recommendations, and purchasing a book. So as you can see, I turned this journey I tried to understand what are the top, for example, 5, 6 steps that I have in this journey, and I defined them as epics, and then I broke down everything that I could for each epic into stories, as you can see here. It's okay if you define a lot of stories. That's fine, It doesn't mean that everything that is here will be done later. That's kind of an indication to know, to be able to implement that journey, what sorts of stories and tasks that we need. But we will go into the kind of prioritization next, and you will see that, it doesn't necessarily mean that everything that is here is we have to do, This can be reviewed all the time. Maybe you start with this story map. 2 weeks later, you decide to merge some of these stories together, or you decide to one of these stories is very big. You want to still break it down into smaller. So all these things can happen. But for the time being, just start with the first draft, I would say, of the story map, and think about it as a live material, something that you constantly change, you constantly update, you constantly improve. And this is how we create a story map for our book recommendation app. Just quickly see if there are any questions.
Yeah, so I've answered a few in the chat. Let's see. Yeah, a few kind of details about user story mapping that we went over. There was another customer journey question in the private Q&A, which was, during the customer journey, should we focus only on functional aspects or also consider non-functional requirements like security, privacy, governance, accessibility, etc.? What do we suggest?
And I guess a great question, because
it is, right? Do you want to go for it?
We have a slide later which we talk about what needs to be in the story, inside the story, what's the content of the story looks like. And a very short answer for now is that, yes, we are already considering NFRs or security data and non-functional requirements as part of the story. We don't have a separate story for them. They are part of the stories that we already have. But if you bear with me for another 10 minutes, we will go through some slides which talks about, now we have the stories, what needs to be inside the stories, and we will talk about those NFRs.
Yeah, and I think maybe just to add to that, the question was about the customer journey part too, like whether you include that stuff in there. I think it really depends on your user context and like how critical that is to them. When you're defining your customer and like saying, maybe doing some sort of empathy map or something that says like what they care about and where they are in their life, maybe they are super sensitive to data privacy issues, maybe, right? And so that could be part of the persona or the documentation that you put together about your user. But even if you don't, even if that isn't like the most critical thing to know about your user, that doesn't mean that we won't cover those in stories to develop in the product. So I think it's okay if you don't have some of those pieces as part of the customer journey. Include them if you think it's really critical to your particular target audience. But otherwise, definitely include them in the latter steps that Miriam's going to go over. Hopefully that helps.
Thank you. I don't see any more questions in the chat that you haven't answered. Let me know if there is anything.
Sure.
So moving on to, now we have identified the story map as well as the customer journey, target audience, and everything. So now what should we do with this story map? What is the next step? So the next step is to go and define minimum viable product, or when we say MVP, or what is the next major release in case you already have a product built. You want to see what is coming next. So let's just go through the definition of MVP or minimum viable product. Well, obviously in product development, the minimum viable product is a product that is just enough or has enough features to satisfy early customers. It's just enough to be able to share that with people, get their early feedback and see what they think. So it's not definitely a complete, totally version of the product or the feature. It's just what is absolutely minimum. So it has enough value that people are willing to use it or even willing to buy it initially. And it showcases a very thin slice of the value proposition that the product offers. And also it demonstrates enough feature benefit to the early adopters so that they can provide feedback loop for further future developments. So if it's a very easy kind of way to remember this, just think about if wedding cake has like 10 layers, MVP of that wedding cake is a cupcakes version of that wedding cake. So it's just enough for you to know, to taste the cake, to know how it looks like and how it will be, but it's not as big as a wedding cake. So basically, MVP is very important in product development, because if you want to go through iterative development, which is the way forward these days for making any products, having a very well-defined minimum viable product is super important to make sure that we have right amount of work at the beginning ready for the people to use it and give us feedback. So it's very important now to understand what are the steps to create MVP. I'm sure many of you here are experts in trying to define MVP, but for the people who haven't done this before, or they want to just see something new, this is the method that we usually use in our projects. So what we do is that this is an activity that you want to really do with your whole team, because that's Bringing different people's perspective from different disciplines, such as tech, product, design, and even from the business is important to make sure we have defined the right MVP. So first of all, you bring the whole team who needs to be the team into the room, and you start reviewing all the epics and stories which we showed you in the last system. Then you basically create two different buckets. One is called must-have, one is called nice-to-have. And you start one by one each story to assign them to one of these buckets. This is a really good opportunity for the whole team to have honest conversation about if this story is really needed, if this is really urgent and crucial to have, or it can be done later, it's a nice to have. So once you've done this kind of like sorting of putting all the stories into these buckets, go one more time to the must-have bucket and check if there is still anything there that you can move to nice to have. So once this is done, continue this kind of process until there is no story in the must-have bucket that can be moved to the nice to have. So that must-have bucket is your MVP, is all the stories that you absolutely should do for the first release of your product. So if you already have the product and you already want to know what is the next release, you can do exactly the same process to think about what could be in your next release of the product. What is the minimum thing you can release next? So the same process you can follow for that as well. So let's go back to book recommendation app and see how we can define MVP. So I bring this story map to the room with the different disciplines that I have in a room, different experts, and I want to now see what our MVP looks like. So I created two different buckets, nice to have and must have, and we try to assign everything to one of these buckets. And this is what I have as my MVP. So I went through all these stories and I noticed that I don't need really all of them, absolutely all of them, for the first release. First release is just for me to get some feedback, making sure I'm on the right path. I'm kind of building the right thing for the customer. So it's not end of the world if I don't have absolutely everything. So in the sign up epic, I only picked sign up with Facebook because that's an easiest one. Most people have Facebook. It's very easy. Implementation wise is also very easy. And it gives me a way for people to sign up to the app. In the login, I keep log in and log out. But it's not end of the world if we don't put forget password or reset password, because we can assume people still remember their login details. Activity timeline, I only include the view latest friends activity. I will leave the liking and commenting on the activities for later. That can be definitely something can be done later. And in my library, I keep the view my books and add a new book, because that's the main functionality of our application. People want to add their books that they read and be able to view their library. So, but it's okay if they cannot edit a book or title of the book at the moment, or review a book. I can leave that for later. And in terms of recommendations and purchasing a book, I will leave all of those two topics, everything around those topics for later, because I want to really test the bare bone version of this application, which is book recommendation and the list of the books that I read, and to be able to see if the very basic application works or not. So this is how my MVP looks like. I have 6 stories that I included in my MVP. And I'm not saying the rest of the things can be ignored. It's just they are nice to have and can absolutely be prioritized for after our MVP is out and in hands of customers. So, any questions so far regarding MVP?
Doesn't really seem like it.
Yeah, we have it relatively quiet. Usually this course goes crazy with questions and everything. So yeah, but if there's any questions at all, put it in a chat or in QA. There is no bad question. All the questions are good and we are more than happy to answer. But if you prefer to go through the course first and then answer your questions, that's also absolutely fine. We can definitely stay at the end of the session for any questions you have. Totally. Great. So now we have our MVP defined. So we have been through all 4 steps for now. Is that it?
Actually, we have a question that came in. before you get too far into this one? Like,
yeah,
okay.
once it's new.
Yeah, so PG asks, is it a rule of thumb that we should focus only on must-have epics and user stories since we're going to define the minimum viable product? I think just kind of clarifying that it's a must-have ones. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. It's a must-have one because we have limited time and limited resources we want to kind of release the MVP as soon as possible. So all the nice things, as they sound like it, they can wait for later. But all the must-haves must be done through the MVP. So yeah, we only focus on must-have buckets. Thank you. So now we all went through all the steps until step 4. We have our MVP defined, or we have our next major release defined, and we know what we want to do. Now we want to dig into details of now we identified, for example, in our case, these stories as MVP. So what should we put inside the stories? How best to define the stories in a way that is understandable for everyone, which is a very, very important aspect of story writing, because, stories are like at the heart of every product development. And it's very important to make sure people kind of write the stories in a way that is understandable by the team and is kind of easy to share with everyone. Story writing can be totally different from one team to another one. Even who writes the stories can be different from one team to another. I've been part of the team which only business analysts write stories. I've been part of the team which was the responsibility of everyone in the team to write stories. So I think it just depends on how technical is your project, how much context the story writing needs. But the best practice, in our opinion, is to just have everyone in the team be involved in a way for writing stories. Maybe joining for some sessions for writing stories together. But the important thing is the whole team understands it. And this can, there are some suggestions in terms of how best to write your stories, but you will need to practice a couple of times and see what works for you and for your team. But we have a framework here. We call it INVEST, which is a very, very helpful framework to think about when you're writing your stories, which talks about what criteria a story should have. So the INVEST is coming from 6 different kind of words. First of all is independent. It's very important for each story to be independent of other stories. You might have been already in the situation when you had stories which are dependent to each other. They are blocked on each other, so you can't touch one of them without finishing the other one. So this is the situation we want to avoid as much as we can, because that means one of the stories is always blocked, and that means the person who's working on, or the pair who's working on, is always blocked. So we want to write them as independent as possible. So it makes the story writing easier, the development is easier, and it reduces the dependency to kind of other pairs or other people. So it's very ambitious if we say totally, fully, 100% independent stories. But let's try to minimize it as much as we can by understanding exactly what each story is about and trying to write it in a way that is independent of the other stories. The next one is negotiable. So stories are not a written contract. I've been, again, in a situation where the person who writes the story just write the story without any conversation with the people in the team, and they expect them to have full understanding of what is the story about. We are talking about a story here which is a really good placeholder for negotiation, for conversations, and kind of it only should capture the essence of what is needed. But all the single details doesn't need to be captured here. It can be through conversation that the people have. When we pick up the story, they can challenge the story, they can challenge the value, they can even challenge the solution that people are going to pick up for this story. So make sure you look at the stories as a placeholder for conversation. Those conversations at the beginning of picking the story, or even in the middle of doing it, are so valuable, and we don't want to miss that. So valuable is another thing to think about. So you want to think about all the time, you want to ask this question: why are we doing this story at all in the first place? Who is going to get benefit? Who's going to get the value? What's the value of this story? Some some stories are totally no value aligned to them. And, you don't want to waste your time and effort doing something that adds no value to anyone's life. So it's very important to understand for each story, what is the value that we want to we want to deliver, who is going to receive that value, and it has a very clear value written inside the story. So I personally always start my stories with the value written at the top. So everyone open a story, they can quickly see, oh, we are doing this story because of achieving this value. Estimable. So estimation. Someone asked in the chat about estimation. I know estimation can be sometimes a really big pain for us, because sometimes as the word estimate is saying, there is lots of uncertainty about estimation. You don't know something until you start doing it or until you start digging into the details. But let's just say estimation here is just basically something to tell us roughly what we're looking at in terms of story. Is this going to be a massive task? Is it going to be a kind of very small task? So it helps with your project manager or program manager to have some sort of ideas about the timeline and delivery of your stories. However, we always say that estimates are estimates. You should always keep an eye on having anything unexpected coming up, talking about it, or if there is anything that needs to be reviewed, the estimation should always be reviewed. And one of the things is that the next point is about small. We want to make sure that the stories are kind of relevant size to each other. So we don't want to have very big stories and then some very small stories. We want to have some sort of similar size stories to each other as much as we can. So in that case, again, be able to plan, be able to do any sort of communication to stakeholders is easier, because we have some sort of ideas in terms of when and how much risk is involved into doing the stories. And also something that we always say, that large stories usually tend to produce big waste. Because when your story is very big, you spend a lot of time on it. The context is shared between multiple people, and people might have to remember things from the very beginning again, and things change. I've been part of one team that one story took like 2 months, and then they had to really throw everything away and start again with breaking that into smaller stories. So be careful with the amount of waste sometimes can be associated to very big stories. And also testing is a very important aspect of software development these days. You want to make sure what you build is working properly, is working fine. And be able to test the stories is super important. So you want to write the stories in a way that your QA and your developers can go through the points and understand how best to test the stories, how best they can define some good tests for the stories. So let's say, for example, one of the things that can help is acceptance criteria that we talk about later. Acceptance criteria are super helpful for making sure that the story is testable, and we can make sure the functionality works as expected. Okay.
There are a couple questions. Maybe this is a good time to jump in there. So one of them, which is a great one, is it possible to add business value along with user value? I love this question.
Absolutely. So when we talk about value, we talk about whatever value that it adds to anyone's life. It can be adding value to a customer, to a business, or maybe we were talking about a technical story. A technical story is when you're writing some codes that could maybe add value to some bunch of developers somewhere else to be able to use your code and then to be able to get the value. So your target audience for value can be anyone. Important thing is to have a target audience, to have a value for someone in your story. But as long as that's there, definitely. Business value, customer value, they're all part of the same value definition for a story.
Great. And then there's one other question, which is really about making something small enough. So I can read it to you now, or if you want to save, specifics about like small enough stuff for later, we could do it later too. What do you think?
Okay. So one thing I want to really make sure about the value, I would say, look at this cake. If someone offers you this cake and tells you, do you want a slice from the first layer? You might ask, no, I want to have the slice from all the layers. So this is how we look at the stories in terms of like how we want to make sure when we talk about value, how to impress people with the value that we create by our stories. So when you're writing a story, think about some values when the story is completed. What could be the value for the business? What could be the value for the customers? What could be value for technology team? What could be value for everyone else? So everyone can get a kind of, there's a layer of all the values. And when we are presenting this story, we can present everyone a slice of this cake rather than a slice of just one layer. So this is another great practice to think about when you're thinking about the value, when you're doing a story, to just, what are the people or what are the layers that I can present in my stories that can add value to different people in the organization. So another thing to say, what now based on that INVEST framework that said these are the kind of criteria for good stories, let's just see what we have to capture in a user story. Obviously, there are a lot more that you can, these are all the kind of like recommendations that we have as the kind of minimum things that you can consider in the stories, but depends on your context, depends on your project, you can absolutely add to this list. But first thing that we all have to it's the absolutely must have is to add the business or customer value to your story. So whoever gets the benefit, whatever value you deliver, you have to mention it very clear in the story. So when someone opens that story, they read the first sentence about the value, they should understand why we are doing this story in the first place. Acceptance criteria are also another super important kind of part of each story. It's basically talking about, maybe I missed one slide, but I just want to talk acceptance criteria here. Acceptance criteria are kind of help us define the scope of the story. Because, when you talk about one story, even if it looks like a very simple one, it can go forever. You know that, you can add all different what ifs or what this, if that to that story. But at some point you want to have scope. You want to make sure you understand how much we go further into creating the story. Acceptance criteria is a great help for describing the kind of like the scope. And also it's great help to describe the behavior of the system and user flow. This is where we go through all the details of like exactly at each point what should happen, what we expect, and what the functionality should look like at the end. There are different formats to implement that. The format that we use a lot and it's really helpful is that given, when, then. In the given, you write the context and context of which situation you are in. When is the action you take, and the expectation then is what you expect to happen as a result of the actions that you just took. So you can have as many acceptance criteria as you want. So it's not, some stories just have one or two, some stories might have 20, 30. It's okay to have as many acceptance criteria as possible if they are making it clear for developers in terms of what to develop and what to test. Usually when we talk about acceptance criteria, we talk about 3 different paths, which are going to be helpful for us to just make sure everything is in the right place. So the happy path is what we expect exactly to happen with an action. So we do the action, the context, the action, and then the expectation happens. Sad path is the one which users go on unsuccessful outcome. In the eye of a user, the action is not going to have the outcome that we're expecting. An alternative path is when something unexpected happens, and we have to also consider if through the path that we go, when they are having a context, an action, something happens that no one expects.